We wanted to delay our arrival just to get the sense of anticipation going for you. Thanks for playing the killer song. We were commenting that Brandon Flowers, lead singer, is from Mike's home state of Utah. So, we agreed that Mike and Thad is like a radio show that you're about to experience. So we hope you're ready for it. So a year ago, I sat on the stage and was part of a panel, and we talked about the vision that we had for our company working with government. And at the time, no states had really come out and supported what was going on in the blockchain community to the extent that we're witnessing here this year. And certainly your roles as the head of blockchain for all things in Colorado and the CIO for Utah, you've been at the forefront of what's going on in the blockchain community because you've been getting, what I like to say is getting government out of the way of business and enabling a path for businesses that are involved with blockchain to work in your two states. So maybe if we could, I'll start at the outside and work my way back in. Okay. So Mike, talk about the environment that you've created. What makes it so positive to work in Utah?
You know, one of the things that we do in Utah is just try and create a culture of innovation. And if we can create that culture, you start to see the technology blossom, the emerging technologies and whatnot. And so we've tried to create a center of excellence for artificial intelligence. We've tried to create a culture with an innovation fund. A lot of things, but I think it stems from even leadership at the very top with our executives and the governor's office, the legislature, and to start to look at what are the opportunities as far as emerging technologies go. And so developing that culture has created, I think, some momentum in the blockchain space where we're starting to look at opportunities like we're talking about some of the things we're doing in Utah. We're looking at our voting. We're now doing some online absentee ballots now through blockchain technology, and that's creating a little more momentum as you start to dip your toe in the water and find a solution such as absentee ballots. Think, hey, how can we take that to the next step? Maybe we look at voting from an online perspective completely. Our lieutenant governor has said, hey, you know, this new technology that he calls blockchain, he's a little uncertain what it is, could lead to that challenge that the state is facing. So you find those challenges, you find the ways to overcome them, and then you find those kinds of solutions. So by just dipping your toe in the water, finding the value that can come out of it will lead to that next great thing. So those are some of the things that we're doing, or at least how we're creating that momentum, at least as far as blockchain goes.
Yeah, I can attest to it from doing business with you and out in Utah. It's a welcoming environment. You're open to new ideas, and I think that's the key, is that you're not turning anyone away. And there's a lot of interesting things about what you're practically doing that we'll get to. Yeah. And I think it's very interesting how you're engaged in the community. But Thad, tell us about Colorado. It's one of the few states that has someone with a title like yours who is really in charge of this blockchain initiative that Colorado is trying to endeavor upon.
That's right. We, in Colorado, passed some legislation under our previous governor, Governor Hickenlooper, that established a blockchain council in order to sort of look at what legislation might be enacted within the state in order to enhance our state's understanding of blockchain in general, and in particular some of the issues around cryptocurrency and the legalities of whether it's a token, whether it's a security, these sorts of issues. That council ended up putting some legislation forward, and interestingly, blockchain, my role as blockchain solutions architect for the state of Colorado was established through that legislation. Now, I'm not aware of any state legislation anywhere that it enabled the hiring of a SQL Server admin or a MySQL admin. I think the only reason that we look at why some legislation might be necessary around blockchain as a technology in and of itself is really to overcome some of the perceptions around blockchain equals Bitcoin equals guns, drugs, and stolen credit card numbers on the dark web. We're trying to really separate that out as a technology in and of itself that has use cases really any way you turn your head and you look at government data, you see the need for transparency, for security, for keeping track of things, for tokenizing assets. It's really sort of the core of what government does with data. So my role at the state of Colorado is really to look at what solutions are applicable to what different agencies to evaluate the existing application suite that we've got, looking at as applications are replatformed or moved from internal data centers into cloud architectures. How does blockchain fit into that, if at all? And really evaluate it as a viable and useful technology to enhance the state's information technology.
So on that front, you've done some interesting work on digital identity. And that is a hot button topic for many as they try to figure out how to go down the identity path. Could you talk about what you're doing with digital identity?
Sure. We actually launched a digital driver's license that is used for most state identification purposes. I say most because it's not used by the law officers or for travel. But it is acceptable identification throughout the state for purchasing alcohol, going to bars, buying marijuana, all of the things that you need identification to do in our state. That is basically looked at as somewhat of an on-ramp in terms of introducing people to using digital ID, to not needing to necessarily have their physical card with them, but to have their mobile device with them, which would have their payment applications on there, as well as their digital identification. What we're looking at providing are basically endpoints so that individuals can control their own identity. Self-sovereign identity is certainly a hot topic, and one that is really sort of the bullseye of a lot of the different blockchain use cases that sort of follow the spectrum. Those can each sort of be implemented individually, and because of the fact that there are so many companies and organizations out there focusing on very specific verticals related to blockchain implementation, things like supply chain or credentialing applications, what we're looking at is trying to create some viable endpoints for user identity in order to create attestation services that can bridge the different blockchain technologies that are in use in order to provide a authenticity and the ability for individuals to decide what they want to share that's related to their identity, whether that's their professional credentials, their higher education credentials, or even blocking out the address on their ID. Because when you submit your ID to purchase alcohol, for instance, the only thing that bouncer needs to know is whether it's binary. It's are you who you say you are, and are you old enough? They don't need to know where you live. They don't need to know all of the incidental information that is on a physical ID. So being able to allow individuals to control what information they share is sort of the ultimate end game.
That's awesome. As I always think about my two sisters and going to bars and the illogical nature of them having to share their address while they're out to people that they don't know. It's great that Colorado's paving a way. Now, Mike, you're doing some really interesting things with voting, with vehicle titles, somewhat self-serving, but you're also finding paths towards different projects in unique ways. Could you talk about the types of projects you're doing?
Yeah, I just briefly mentioned the online voting, or what we're trying to get to. And if you look at, frankly, just the expense of that, that's one of the drivers that are pushing us into those kinds of spaces where the cost of an election and the validation of that election afterwards certainly is challenging for states and counties to get through that. So one county right now is doing it, absentee ballots on blockchain, and that seems to be going very well. There's a lot of attention right now as to whether or not that vote is cast accurately, and there's all this attention around voting machines and whether or not that's working well. And so now if you have this validation on blockchain, it takes all that guesswork out, and there's maybe a little more trust in the election system. And then one that's been a great use case for, I think, states was certainly vehicle titles. And that stems from, I'm glad you guys came into the picture, because I remember the only reason when my son purchased his car after I'd come into this position was we had to go transfer a vehicle. He bought a car, had to transfer title, and it just seemed to me that was the one thing that or at least citizens shouldn't have to be doing to go into a state building. And so we were looking at how do we drive more control to the citizens. That's like a crypto asset, if you will, and it can be transferred. It can be very similar to the emerging technologies around Bitcoin or other cryptocurrency, and so why not apply that in that space? And so we looked at how much effort it would be into developing a technology like that, and then when we learned about you guys, I thought, hey, this is exciting. This is exactly, I thought, the low-hanging fruit for states to go after. And you look at what we do as far as pushing transactions online. We do about 40 million transactions online a year. And we also noticed that we're saving about $14 to the state per transaction. So when you're doing 40 million transactions at a savings of $14 per transaction, that's real money if you can push more of that online. So again, with my son having to go into a facility to conduct that transaction, I thought, hey, we can save more money from the state's perspective if we move more of those transactions online. We don't have to build facilities. Citizens are much happier. And then we're actually doing a study now of how much we're saving the citizen. We know how much we're saving the state. There's equal value or probably greater value for the citizen if they don't have to take time off work, don't have to set foot in a building, maybe drive a number of miles. Why not push that and make that more available to the citizen? Again, kind of what you said earlier, getting government out of the way so that the citizens can transact that more efficiently.
I didn't know that number. Doing the quick math in my head, $560 million of savings just by pushing. So every transaction, you're gathering up more savings. I think that's a model that everyone would love.
Yeah.
You could run for office on that platform.
Oh, that's a great idea. I might do that.
Certainly in a time when it's tough for the left and the right to figure out how to get anything done legislatively, you turning internal and then saving taxpayers over $500 million just by moving transactions online, something that is pretty common for most other fields beside government. That's pretty fantastic. I know it's not, and you're right, it's not just the consumers. I remember you telling me an interesting story about the ecosystem around titles where there's a bank, we'll let them remain nameless. You said that their approach to titles was that it was so full of friction that every time they receive a title for a car they've given a loan on, they immediately shred it, as opposed to keeping it, because it was just easier to go back and get a duplicate. Is that sort of the thing you see now?
And we're still seeing that with a number of banks and lending institutions, actually, on those vehicle titles. It's too expensive to track them. When they receive that, as they're the lien holder on that title, to just track that title and file it and keep track of it, it's easier for them to just track it electronically. They shred it, and then when they satisfy the loan and they are satisfying the lien, they need to send the title back out. They just request a duplicate from the state. Costs about $40 for the lending institution to receive a new one, and then they send that out to the citizen. And so wouldn't that be great? Plus there's a lot of latency in that process, not just money, but latency. And so if you could take a lot of that out of that equation, think of the value to the lending institutions, even insurance companies, if there's to satisfy the title transaction that might occur with a vehicle that may be totaled. There's a lot of efficiencies, and so if you can do that, and interestingly, that's almost the expectation of the citizens these days. We do a lot of pushing those transactions online, having a government available 365 days a year, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day by these transactions moving online. And that's becoming the expectation that things move a little more quickly. And so government's trying to rise to that and rise to that challenge.
Well, I know as we roll out our solution in Utah, certainly we'll charge less than $40. So tell all the banks we'll charge less than $40. But the neat thing is, and this is true for both of you, you're not trying to take on the project and solve it on your own. In fact, it's not even that we're not even a vendor to you. You've merely made it possible for vendors like us to exist in your state and offer you a solution. You're essentially opening up a data access pathway for us to be able to communicate with you. And Thad, you brought up something interesting earlier about this concept of folks not having to hire a MySQL expert every time that they have a solution that comes through. And we've been using this in different discussions with various government entities, saying, why are you so focused on blockchain as a solution as opposed to the best path might end up with a blockchain solution? Could you talk a little bit more about that environment that you created where even though you're the blockchain guy, so you have every incentive in the world for more blockchain projects to happen, you're creating an environment where really it's about finding the right solution for Colorado?
Sure, that's absolutely right. I think that part of my job as a blockchain solutions architect is really to look at the overall convergence of a bunch of different technologies. Blockchain is certainly one of them, but IoT is certainly one of them. 5G and high capacity networking is certainly another one, and I think that convergence really contributes to what's going to be Web 3.0, right? Part of what we do is evaluate solutions that come in from vendors. So if we need a application that tracks alternative livestock, which if you don't know what that is, in Colorado at least, it's livestock like elk that are ranched, things that are non-traditional. And it's a much smaller market, obviously, than mainstream livestock, but it faces the same challenges in terms of tracking ownership of the animals, tracking their vet visits, tracking their immunizations, and their diseases and illnesses. So when we look at something like that, we put that out as a business case that needs solving. We don't specify necessarily the technology that's behind it. We certainly have technology standards and requirements, but those can be met through a number of different stacks and platforms. We want vendors to consider blockchain as just being part of the normal course of solutioning. So when we look at evaluating solutions that come in, they may be built bespoke, or they may be a customized sort of off-the-shelf solution that a vendor has on offer that they provide hosting for in the cloud, and we don't necessarily need to worry about the back end or the storage engines if it's blockchain based, and that's absolutely great as long as the solution accomplishes the business case that we need to have solved for, and it passes the security requirements of our CISO office. We're good to go.
I know, Mike, you were talking to me earlier about how you're taking your RFP process and even making that simpler, and you bring a very common sense approach to it. Maybe so I don't steal your thunder, walk people through what it is that you're doing with your RFP process.
We're certainly, you look at time to market on just developing the RFP sometimes for states can be 18 months just to define the scope sometimes, and by the time that the RFP hits the streets, the technology has already moved on, and so you're trying to figure out ways that you might be a little more innovative on the RFP process or getting out to market. And so one of the things that we're trying is just to toss the business challenge out to the business community. Say, this is what the state's dealing with. And the story I told you backstage is Oklahoma was doing something very similar, and they said, hey, we're trying to place foster children in foster homes, sometimes at 1 and 2 in the morning. It's very difficult for us. And so geographically, they're trying to find available homes that are compatible with that child when a child comes into state custody. And so instead of developing an RFP process that defined all this scope and thousands of pages, they just said, the challenge for us is to place foster children in the middle of the evening and geographically, and just kind of really develop the business case well. And somebody that developed a pizza delivery app said, hey, that's a great app that will just a few tweaks and now I can place foster children. And so sure enough, that was the solution that they went with. And so we're following that same model. We're just going to say, hey, we need this business solution, and let the vendor community respond and see what kind of solutions come in, whether it be a blockchain solution or something else. We really don't care what the underlying technology is. Rather, does this solve the business need that the state has, and does it work well with the other things that we're doing? So all of a sudden, you'll see going out to market being a little more expeditious, getting that solution back in. There may be a little more vetting that occurs, but we're starting to look at some of the best value for the state now in that kind of solution.
I think that's welcome to the ears of everyone that's in business trying to figure out how to work with government, is to not be one in a RFP hell where you're waiting for months to figure out what the document might say, ultimately then reading it and realizing it it zigged left when you thought it was going to zag right, and ultimately not being able to actually provide your solution because of an RFP that's too restrictive. I think that's a very thoughtful way to go about it. Some other thoughtful things that your states have done, and in Ohio, we have Innovate Ohio, which launched about a year ago, which is our sort of innovation fund to try to bring more innovative emerging tech into the state. Talk about how in Utah, and then Thad as well in Colorado, but Mike, starting in Utah, talk about how you have approached the Innovation Fund, how it's funded, what you're allowed to use the money for, and whether or not you can forecast it'll exist into the future.
Great, yeah, and I think that's really one of the things that allows us to venture into some of these new technologies, that Innovation Fund. What I was mentioning earlier, that Innovation Fund was basically seed money from the legislature that said, hey, as long as there's a solution that's going to cross boundaries between agencies, let's explore it. And so and actually gives employees in the state an opportunity to say, hey, I have this idea I think will help the state move the ball forward on developing some new innovative thing. And then now there's an innovation fund to draw on. Now there's truly a budget process in the state where the submission goes to the governor's office of management and budget, says, hey, this agency would like to develop this. A lot of times though, there's an agency that has money and another agency that does not. And so how do you bring those two together when you say, hey, there is a solution that crosses boundaries here, and we can't do it because one agency doesn't have some funds or resources available. So this fund will allow us to cross that divide and say, look, there is a solution in the market. Let's develop it. Let's bring it in, and then that ROI can be talked about and pitched to generate more. Now, it's an ongoing appropriation right now from the legislature, but we were looking at how Michigan did it, and that ROI is reinvested in the Innovation Fund. I think right now, the agencies just to get to see that opportunity realized in their agency or two, but we're looking at it now from a perspective, hey, just take that money, reinvest it in your business process, and make things more efficient in the state. So we had a technology advisory board that was developed. There's a lot of public, private sector folks on that board, but the legislature, in an effort to get government out of the way, they killed a lot of the boards and commissions just to let things happen a little more quickly. So they killed that board. So now it's just on me to approve those projects. I still bring in the private sector, and we still have a board that meets more of an ad hoc basis to look at the ideas that are put forward and to approve them or to refine them and go back to the drawing board and bring them back. But there's a lot of effort now in developing voice skills with the Amazon Echo. That's come out of that. So one skill we're developing now is to get election information. So again, very election-centric. So you can ask a digital assistant whether or not what's on your ballot, and then is there information I should know about that candidate or about that issue, and the voice assistant will tell you all about it, exactly what's on your ballot based on a geolocation that happens with that device. So it's really exciting to see some of the innovative ideas that are coming out, and allows us to do some things like blockchain that we're always been challenged on how to get there. We have these great ideas, but how do we fund them and get them going? And sometimes it takes a little seed money to do that.
You should just tell the governor that you'll take a 10% rake on whatever savings you provide. So right now he owes you $56 million.
Boy, I need you as an agent. That's a great idea, yeah.
Well, we haven't talked about my fee.
Oh, okay. I'm happy to split that. So yes, absolutely.
That's great. All right, so I'm $28 million richer. I'm going to leave now. But Thad, maybe you could talk about how Colorado's funding some of these initiatives.
Yeah, so Colorado has also an innovation fund. A lot of that innovation fund is focused really towards a lot of economic development, specifically around technologies. There's a decentralized database exchange in Colorado called Shapeshift. Hopefully some of you have heard of them, if not everyone. They received some grant money from Colorado's Innovation Fund when they first started up the company as students out of Colorado State University up in Fort Collins. They now have offices in Denver. They employ over 50 people. It's a real organization providing some real advancement to not only blockchain technology around the world, but also to our local economy in Colorado. We also use that innovation fund money to do things like fund hackathons, one of which we've got coming up here hopefully within the next couple months, that is a blockchain-specific focused hackathon where we've gathered use cases from across our entire dozen-plus agencies and departments and sort of narrowed them down to a handful that we're going to put out there and allow student groups, startup groups, established companies, basically anyone to take that use case and give it their best MVP shot over the course of a month, allow our judges to evaluate and award cash prizes for those. The best of those use cases will most likely be put into an agile RFP process whereby we take that MVP and flesh out what it needs to become production ready and put that out to bid through our traditional bid system. But much like Utah, we're trying to move into a more agile, less waterfall-y mode of acquiring services and consultancies to give back a response to those. So the end result of the hackathon competition should be use cases that are in MVP stage, ready to move forward. Hopefully that greases the rails a little bit to allow smaller companies and groups to congeal and actually become companies and be able to provide services to the state through our vendor portal, which is oftentimes very cumbersome and really difficult to deal with, especially for smaller companies responding to traditional project charter-based RFPs that require a lot of upfront work that's not paid and really sort of favorites much larger companies that are in a position to respond to those.
Yeah, that is the oddity. Speaking from experience, coming from a large Wall Street institution and competing for RFPs with states, and now in a small tech company, there's just not enough time or money in the day for a small company to be able to compete. And the large RFP processes, unfortunately, wind up favoring the larger companies because they can spend time on it, whereas the smaller companies burn the cash in the meantime. So what I'm hearing from both of you, which is compelling, is that you've created a path for small bites to be taken. So it's not a 6-month or 1-year test. It's a 30-day leading to an MVP. It's not voting in aggregate. It's voting first for absentee ballots in a particular county. It's taking a small bite, and the small bite is what teaches and informs whether or not the project will be successful. And from bouncing around the country, we see that states that do it that way, as opposed to a state saying, oh, we're going to digitize all medical records. Well, that'd be great, but it's theoretically not going to happen in 30 days or 60 days or 3 years. So talk about the small bite concept. Maybe, Mike, start with what you're doing with voting or other projects where you're taking these small bites and then turning them into bigger, effective projects.
And I think you've nailed it spot on. I mean, we look at maybe some emerging technologies and is there a play there for us or not? And so it's kind of our way of dipping our toe in the water to see if it really is going to stick. And if you look at where things are on a hype cycle, you want to make sure that you're catching it at the right time. And so we just released an app for the Apple Watch where you can track legislation as it's moving through the process. And so if it's in a committee, it'll notify you, hey, these are the bills you're tracking, and it's in committee, or it's just voted on, and it will give you that information. And it seems to all of a sudden have a lot of traction. So now do we continue to go down that road of developing apps for the watch or other vendor watches or wearables? And all of a sudden you start to see a little traction in that space, and then you run with it. And so really, if we were trying to say, hey, let's develop a waterfall-y, I like that word, by the way, a waterfall-y type of application that is going to do a caseworker development on the watch, you'd never do something like that. But if just a little minor thing that was easy to push out, easy to develop, and then all of a sudden, let's look at the traction, and yeah, that's a good play for us. And so we start to go down that road. It really does help to nibble away at it rather than try and solve all of it. The same thing with the Amazon Echo was the first one we did on voice assistants. We said, hey, just push out information about the state and take a driver's license practice exam. And I noticed my neighbor, who was struggling to pass the written test, passed it after I loaded the skill on her Echo. She went through maybe a couple dozen times and then was able to pass the test. And I think, hey, maybe there's a play there. So now we start to develop a little more momentum. So you just can't go after everything. There's so much great technology coming into the market. You have to find those things, dip your toe in the water, take a little bite-sized bite at the apple, and then go from there. So it really works well in our environment.
Well, and I think what's interesting is no one is lobbying against that, right? So if you take a big project, you wind up with lobbying and special interest groups that come in and say, well, we don't want it this way, we want it that way. But no one's lobbying against having a better path for taking your driver's test or following legislation on your watch. And by the way, if you haven't come up with a logo for it, it should probably be like a snail. So watch follow legislation through.
It's a good idea. We call it Bill Watch, by the way.
Oh, that's cool. All right, I like that. Thad, what about you? I know you've done many projects, but walk through that small bite process in Colorado.
So we have fostered, sort of from the governor's office on down through all of the directors at the agency level, a real culture of try hard, fail fast, and be agile, right? So part of that involves identifying opportunities and really trying them out, trying to get that MVP in front of someone who knows the business and can really determine. They don't need to know the back-end technology involved. They need to know that it solves their business problem and solves it faster than existing technology does. Now, as a state, obviously, and Mike is certainly aware of the hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that's been already invested in applications that provide these services. No one wants to pick all that up and chuck it, right? I think that blockchain is a great sort of hot sauce to throw on top of that meal. It can enhance the transparency, it can enhance the trust, and it can sort of make it a little bit better. And by doing that and enhancing the existing technology with new technology, we can try it in smaller areas and determine whether or not it's going to work well, determine whether or not we can support it from an IT infrastructure perspective, determine whether or not we need to enhance our internal skill sets in order to support work that is maybe provided by a third-party partner or vendor. So in that regard, we really follow the culture of our leadership, and it's a very nonpartisan issue. We don't have to worry so much about politics, about any of the incidental things. Everyone's goal is to make government run more smoothly for the people who rely on its services. And by taking these incremental bites and having a fail-fast attitude, we're able to determine which of those are most productive and best able to be implemented from our government IT side.
Yeah, you mentioned a phrase that gets used, I think, west of the Mississippi, a lot more than east of the Mississippi, which is fail fast. We often find that people don't like to say the word fail because they don't realize the upside of failure. The upside is you learn, and you can't learn without failure. You need that, and that mindset of being willing to try things out and maybe have it fail does ultimately lead to $500 million type of savings that show up if you do it right and do it well. Getting a little more technical, one thing that I know that Colorado's been working on are how to figure out the attestation endpoints. Could you talk a little bit about that? Maybe educate the audience too as to what that means and sure. how you're going after that problem set.
Yep. So in Colorado, we talked a little bit earlier about digital identity. The data belongs to the individual, not to the state, but the state is the steward of that data and information. So by opening up data channels to create attestation endpoints for various different services, most likely across different blockchain platforms, what we hope to do is to enable those trusted attestation points to allow people to share certain attributes about their identity with those institutions or individuals to whom that matters, right? So with the person at the liquor store, that's your age. With the person who you're interviewing with for a new position, that's your educational credentials or your professional credentials. What we want to do is, because we have all of that data, right? We have all of the professional licensing data. We have all of the data that's generated through births, deaths, marriages, divorces, as well as driver's license information and identification information. By providing secure, trusted endpoints for mobile application providers to hook into and allow people to expose the data themselves in their own devices or submitted to agencies or organizations to confirm that data, we establish sort of a trusted path. And I think that that's a very positive way to steward the data because it's not the state who owns it, it's really us who are just holding it for the people who it actually belongs to.
That's compelling because I know I don't mind if my information is shared. I just want to control who I get to share it with, and I think that is the underlying sentiment of most individuals. They're willing to share it, but they want to be able to control who they get to share it with. Mike, I'd love for you to tell the audience about some of the interesting things you do to get out into the community because as we bounce around the country talking to your counterparts and CIOs around the country, every CIO wants to be as cool as you, and I don't say it just to float your boat, but they all mention you. It's like as soon as we know that they know that we know Mike, it's like, okay, because you present well, you speak well, but you do it because I think it is meaningful to you and it's special, and I'm not going to steal your thunder again, but tell us what you do in the community out in Utah that makes it so different than many other states.
Well, first of all, I like skiing, and so there's a great summit that's hosted at the very top of this ski resort, and it's all about blockchain, and so I love going. I'm kind of half joking to say, hey, I want to go ski, but it turns out that it's a great community to be a part of there in Utah. But I currently mine my own crypto, and so I go to some of the meetups, but I want to be out in the community to get the feedback. We always are trying to learn from the state's perspective, where are we missing the boat? And so if I can get out there and personally do that, that's great. But also we're even applying AI to sentiment that comes into the state, and how do we look at the sentiment analysis on where the state might respond. But for me to attend those meetups and to go to this summit that's all centered around blockchain, I'm starting to get a better sense of what's going on on both the vendor community and out in the citizen community. I almost want to put a man on the street and say, hey, why did you come into this facility? What was the challenge for you that the state didn't offer, why you had to come in and conduct that business with the state, why you didn't do it online? And that's the kind of thing I'm trying to learn as I'm out in that community with those meetups, and trying to figure out what I can do from the information coming from those meetups and providing that information back to those meetups, saying, look, this is where the state's challenged. And again, kind of that business challenge, again, going out to the community. Let's talk about solutions that might be in the market that maybe aren't, and maybe where things might massage to go from there. We're looking at, we're very challenged with air quality in the state. We have the way geographically, we're in this bowl where these inversions come in the wintertime, which is our big tourist season to come into the state. And the first thing you do is fly into this smog and this air quality issues. And so let's look to the community to say, hey, what's going on, and what are the things going on out in the community that can help the state solve that? And it's just interesting to be out there, like I said, on a man on the street kind of perspective, to learn and share the challenges and then figure out how to come together.
Yeah, what a stark contrast. I can say from experience, we see states like Colorado, Utah, Ohio that have paths to openness. Ohio's got, like I mentioned earlier, Innovate Ohio, but the CIO actually going out into the meetups, that's a new one, I think, for most states. There are some states, and I'll let them remain nameless, where literally if you call your counterpart and ask to talk to them, they either will tell you they can't take your call without a special public meeting and enabling everyone in the possible world to be able to come in and listen to everything you have to say. It's become so difficult to work with some governments, and now you've got examples of you're actually going out into the community and doing and reaching out to them. That's pretty special.
Yeah,
Thad, in Colorado, I know there are a lot of groups and efforts around blockchain. What are your favorites, and why do you love your state so much?
For sure. So there really is a great grassroots effort going on in our state called Cryptorado, and it is spearheaded by a number of folks who are sort of in the startup community participate in Denver Startup Week and really support one another in terms of building that community within the technology group that's blockchain and blockchain adjacent, right? So IoT as well as various other technologies that are being developed within our ecosystem, including at the higher ed level. We've got from the start about 6 different agencies that are involved in the Colorado Blockchain Committee, and those range from agriculture to health to economic development and obviously to information technology. Cryptorado really helps to sort of bring together the use cases from across those different organizations and sort of match them with folks from the private sector who have subject matter expertise in what those agencies do, as well as in the technology that can help enable that. So I'm really grateful for the community support that's been built up around that, and hope that for every state there's that capability and support.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly special to see when you think about the bad reputation that government also often has, and these are 2 fantastic examples of places where it's the inverse, where you've got a welcoming CIO going to meetups, you've got Cryptorado, you're doling out money to the winners of a competition, inviting in, making it easier for small companies to come in. For anyone that's starting a company, it should be motivational to hear that the path into government, which can ultimately lead to, I'm sure, a lot of business or a lot of access to revenue, not just necessarily directly from the government, but from what the government can enable. It's a pretty special time to see that that's occurring, and it's certainly not occurring across the totality of the country, so it makes the 2 of you quite special. With a little bit of time we have left, I'd love to touch on a topic that we're starting to see happen in reality in Ohio, which is the influx of venture capital. So venture capital has long had a history in Silicon Valley, also in Silicon Alley in New York, but somehow it's missed a lot of the rest of the country. Certainly in Colorado and in Utah, you've seen much more venture capital than we've seen here, but we're starting to see it here as well, with a handful of funds really becoming more prominent. You've got Medici, which is a famous venture capital firm in the blockchain space. Could you talk about how VC impacts the growth and the importance of having those venture investors physically in your region, and maybe use the Medici example?
Yeah, well, I was going to kind of even go back earlier in the process where we started the University Venture Fund. So we have a fund that is managed by students that we're starting to say, hey, let's start to teach some of these skills that you might want to get into, and maybe create the next Palo Alto in Salt Lake City. I don't know, or whoever. But we're trying to look at teaching those skills so that once these skills are taught, then they leave the state to go to those venture capital headquarters. And so why not start to grow the skills and retain those in the state? And so we're starting to see a lot more momentum that way, where we can, with our University Venture Fund, where students are learning these skills, where they're jumping into some of these nicer, bigger funds in the state, and then kind of grow that economy right in the state of Utah.
Yeah, it's amazing what that does for population growth when you can figure out how to create an environment where the young people want to stay, and not just stay because of the skiing or the outdoor activities, but they want to stay because it's the different, interesting types of jobs that are available to them. And certainly, speaking as an Ohioan, we've got a wonderful, amazing manufacturing sector, but it isn't always where people want to be employed. A lot of times they want to be employed in tech, and in order for there to be tech, you need people to fund tech. Yeah. And so innovative solutions like running it through the universities, or having venture capital firms pop up, or opening yourself up to these smaller company competitions, that's really the key. And it's a great takeaway. I think we all can learn from it in Ohio, but we're on the path with what's going on here as well. But many other states can learn too. This has been educational for me. I've enjoyed spending time with both of you. It's fun to be up with government employees who are innovators. That sentence doesn't get said a lot, but it certainly gets said with the 2 of you. It's really a lot of fun. I hope the audience enjoyed learning about some of the great things that are occurring across the country. And thank you both for your time.
Thank you.